I never gave much thought to past lives. I couldn't care less. It always felt like one of those topics people used to get attention to make themselves sound more interesting. I was at the hardware store when I was restocking shelves at work, lost in thought. As I scanned the aisles, my eyes landed on a customer, and an unshakable chill ran down my spine. My stomach knotted instantly. It wasn't recognition in the usual sense. His face wasn't familiar in any way I could explain. But something deep inside me twisted like my body remembered something my mind refused to grasp. He was a regular at the hardware store where I worked. Tall, wiry, quiet, the kind of guy you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting. But that day, when he stepped up to the counter, I locked eyes with him, and something deep inside me screamed. It wasn't recognition in the usual sense. It was like my bones remembered him, my skin. The fear was instant, irrational, and absolute. I tried to shake it off, but the longer he stood, the more vivid the flashes became. Dirt, a shovel, a night sky, and then pain, blinding pain, then darkness. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because the guy raised an eyebrow and asked if I was okay. His voice, it sent another jolt through me. I had heard that voice before, but not in this life, not in this body. The rest of the day, I was on autopilot. When my shift ended, I drove home in a daze, my hands trembling on the wheel. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw pieces of something I couldn't fully grasp. I saw myself digging in the dirt, my hands raw and bleeding. I saw him standing over me, and then nothing. I started researching past life regression the next day. I didn't want to believe it, but I needed answers. One thing led to another, and soon I found myself in a therapist's office, even though I didn't think it would work or help me figure this shit out. There I was, hypnotized, unraveling a life that wasn't mine, but somehow was. And that's when I remembered everything. I had been a different man, in a different time, and that man, the one who stood at my counter, had murdered me. But here's the thing. I knew what happened next. I knew how he had been caught, how he had served time, and I knew he had gotten out, which meant he was still out there. And somehow our paths had crossed again. The memories came in waves. I saw his face, younger but just as cold, just as cruel. I felt the desperation as I clawed at the dirt, the betrayal as I realized he wasn't going to stop, the knife in my gut, the way my blood soaked the ground, the way my vision had gone black while he stood over me, making sure I was dead. But I hadn't stayed dead. I had come back. And now I had a choice. Pretend I didn't remember or confront the man who had killed me in another life. I wish I could tell you I walked away, that I let it go, but something inside me wouldn't let it rest. I had to know if he remembered me too. So the next time he came into the store, I tested him. I asked him a question, something small, something that should have meant nothing to him, but his reaction told me everything. He froze. Then, ever so slightly, he smiled. And in that moment, I knew he remembered too. I wasn't the only one who had come back. That sparked anger in me, and at that moment, I knew I was going to find them, even if it meant they would believe me or not, and I would have to face this guy on my own. Some memories aren't meant to surface. I learned that the hard way. When I was a kid, I had a dream that kept coming back. I was underwater, staring up at the sunlight filtering through the surface. My lungs burned, my arms flailed, but no matter how hard I kicked, I couldn't reach the air. A boy's voice echoed through the water, whispering my name. And then, darkness. I never told anyone about it. It was just a nightmare, I thought, until I saw the river. I was 10 when my parents moved us to a quiet town in upstate New York. Our new house sat on a wooded property near a slow-moving river. The first time I saw it, something deep inside me recoiled. I knew that river. I didn't know how, but I did. One afternoon, I was exploring the banks when I saw the rock. It was smooth, half buried in the mud, but I recognized it immediately. My fingers traced the grooves carved into its surface. A name. My name. And that's when I heard him. A whisper. barely louder than the rustling leaves. My name was spoken by a voice I knew but couldn't place. I spun around, but no one was there. The woods were silent. The water barely moved. That night, the dream came again, clearer this time. I saw the riverbank, the rock, and a boy standing in the shallows. He was my age, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes locked onto mine. He spoke my name, his voice hollow and desperate. "You know what happened," he said. "You have to remember." I woke up gasping for air. From then on, the memories came in flashes, glimpses of something I shouldn't have known. Running through the woods, bare feet on damp earth. The cold grip of water closed over me. A struggle, hands shoving me down, the boy's face, twisted in fear. And the last thing I saw, the glint of a knife in the moonlight. I wasn't just remembering. I was reliving it. I started digging into the town's history, desperate for answers. My parents thought I was going through a phase, but I couldn't let it go. I searched old newspapers, library archives, and anything that might explain what I saw. And then, buried in a decades-old police report, I found it. 1957. A missing boy, found drowned in the river. His name was Daniel. My name. And next to his name, another one, James. The boy was arrested for his murder. My best friend's name. The boy I had just met a week ago. The boy who had been acting strange ever since I arrived. James invited me to the river that night. He said he wanted to show me something. And as I stood on the bank, heart pounding, I knew this had happened before. The way he looked at me. The way his hand lingered near his pocket. This wasn't the first time. And this time, I wasn't going in the water. Some things are better left forgotten. I wish I had never remembered. I was 6 years old the first time I saw her face in the mirror. My mother was brushing my hair before bed, when for a split second, the reflection wasn't mine. It was a girl with hollow eyes and deep, angry scars slashing across her throat. My scream shattered the silence. My mother assured me it was just my imagination, but I knew what I saw. As I grew up, my dreams started. A cold, dark room, the feel of damp stone beneath my hands, the weight of chains around my wrists, and worst of all, the whispers. Words I didn't understand, but somehow knew were meant for me. By the time I turned 16, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The dreams, the flashes of memories that weren't mine, the overwhelming fear every time I caught my reflection in a dimly lit mirror. It all felt too real. I decided to get answers. A regression therapist in the city specialized in past life memories. I sat in her office, skeptical but desperate. She guided me into a deep state of relaxation, and suddenly, I wasn't in the room anymore. I was somewhere else. Stone walls, a narrow, dirt-covered floor, a girl, me but not me, huddled in the corner of a damp cell, shaking. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and footsteps echoed toward me. A man loomed over me, his face lost in shadow. He spoke, his voice like gravel, and suddenly I knew what was coming. I had been here before. Tortured, accused, and silenced. The memories crashed over me like a tidal wave, and I came back gasping for air. The therapist's concerned face swam into focus, but I was already running out the door. I didn't stop running until I was home, shaking in front of my bedroom mirror. And then I saw her again. This time, she didn't just stare. She reached for me. The moment our fingers touched, the world around me disappeared. I was back in that cell, trapped in a body that wasn't mine. The door burst open, the man lunged, and this time I felt the knife tear across my throat. I woke up on the floor, gasping, my hands clutching my neck, expecting blood. My mirror was shattered, cracks radiating from the center like a web. My mother found me minutes later, shaking, unable to explain what had happened. I've never looked into a mirror the same way again. And sometimes I still see her watching me in the corner of my eye. Some things stay buried, others refuse to be forgotten. I never thought much about reincarnation. It was just one of those ideas you'd hear about but never take seriously. Until the dream started. I was 9 the first time it happened. I woke up in a cold sweat, the taste of dirt in my mouth, the feeling of something heavy pressing down on me. I screamed, kicking and clawing at the air until my mom rushed in and shook me awake. "Just a nightmare," she said, smoothing my hair. "You're safe." But I wasn't. The dream came back, night after night. Each time it lasted a little longer. I could smell the damp earth, feel the sting of rough hands gripping my arms. I could hear voices, low, urgent, filled with panic, and the worst part, I knew deep down that I was being buried alive. As I grew older, the dreams became more vivid. They weren't dreams anymore. They were memories. Memories of a life I had lived before this one. Memories of how I had died. And I knew where it had happened. There was an old farm on the outskirts of town, long abandoned, the fields overgrown with weeds. Every time we drove past it, my stomach twisted. One summer, when I was 15, a few friends dared me to explore it. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't explain why. The moment we stepped onto that land, I knew. The air felt thick and charged, like something was waiting beneath the surface. My chest tightened as we walked through the tall grass, my feet guiding me toward the center of the field without realizing it. And then I saw it. A patch of earth that looked no different from the rest, but my whole body locked up. I fell to my knees, my hands shaking as I brushed away the dirt. My fingers found something hard beneath the soil. Wood. Old, rotting wood. A box. Panic clawed up my throat. My friends called my name, but their voices sounded far away. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what was inside. Me. I had been here before, buried in this field, left to rot in the dark. I scrambled back, gasping, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. My friends stared at me like I was losing it. Maybe I was. That night, I did something I never thought I would. I started researching past lives, reincarnation, anything that could explain what was happening to me. I dug through old town records, scanned through missing person reports from decades ago, looking for something, anything, that would confirm what I already knew in my gut. And I found it. A teenage boy, reported missing, never found. His name was Thomas. My name, in my past life, and next to his name, 2 others. The men last seen with him. The ones suspected of foul play but never charged. They had been his friends. My stomach dropped. I knew those names, because they were my friends now. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. But deep inside I knew the truth. I had been betrayed before, and it was happening again. The next day, my friends asked if I wanted to go back to the field, said they wanted to show me something. My heart pounded as I looked at them, their faces too familiar, their voices just a little too eager. I knew how this story ended, but this time, I wasn't going to let them bury me. They say déjà vu is just a trick of the mind, a glitch in the brain. But what if it's something more? What if it's proof that we've been here before? I never used to think about past lives. Not until the summer I turned 17 and my family moved into that old house on the edge of town. The moment we stepped inside, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a low hum of unease in my gut, a sense that I'd walked through these halls before. But that was impossible. I'd never even been to this town before. The feeling only grew stronger. I started having these moments, fleeting, disorienting flashes of memory that didn't belong to me. Standing in the kitchen, I suddenly knew where every drawer was without opening them. Walking up the stairs, I knew which ones creaked before I stepped on them. I even knew there was a handprint on the wall behind the wallpaper in my bedroom before I peeled it back to see for myself. It wasn't mine. but it fit my hand perfectly. My parents shrugged it off. Just a coincidence, they said. Maybe the last owner had a kid with hands the same size as mine, but I knew better. The memories were coming faster now. Pieces of a puzzle I didn't understand. A smell, a sound, the way the wind whistled through the attic window. It all felt too familiar. And then came the dreams. I dreamed of running, of someone chasing me through the house, up the stairs, into the attic. I dreamed of hands grabbing me, of my own voice screaming. I dreamed of falling, hitting the floor so hard it knocked the air from my lungs. I woke up gasping every time. One night, I stayed up late, determined not to sleep. I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. A whisper, right next to my ear. Run. I jolted upright, my breath coming in short gasps. The room was empty, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone was trying to warn me. I spent the next day digging through town records, trying to find out anything about the house, and then I found it. A newspaper article from 50 years ago. A boy 17 years old had died there. Fell from the attic window, they said. A tragic accident. But in the grainy black and white photo of the house, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A handprint. On the wall in the exact same spot as mine. It wasn't an accident. I knew that now. And the dreams weren't just dreams. They were memories. My memories. I had lived in this house before. I had died in this house before. And somehow I was back. That night, I locked my door, but it didn't matter. The moment I closed my eyes, I was there again, running, gasping, trying to escape something I couldn't see. And just before I woke up, just before the fall, I heard that voice again. Run. This time I listened. Some memories are waterlogged, heavy, impossible to shake loose. But given enough time, they always rise to the surface. I was 6 years old the first time I drowned, or at least that's what it felt like. It happened in the bathtub. My mother had stepped out for just a moment, just long enough to grab a towel. But in those few seconds, something went wrong. 1 minute I was playing, the next I was underwater, my tiny body convulsing as I sucked in a lungful of bathwater. The terror was instant, but it wasn't the water that scared me. It was the memory that came with it. Because for a moment, I wasn't in the bathtub anymore. I was in a lake, a deep, dark lake. My limbs weren't small and chubby. They were strong, lean. I was older, a man, and I wasn't alone. Someone was holding me under. I woke up coughing, my mother shaking me, her face pale with panic. She thought I had slipped. An accident. But I knew better. It wasn't the first time I had drowned. It was just the first time in this life. The memories never left me. Every time I got near deep water, something in me screamed. Showers made my heart pound. Swimming pools left me lightheaded. I never understood why until the nightmares started. I dreamed of the lake, of struggling against invisible hands, of lungs burning, limbs flailing, the cold pressing in. But worst of all, I dreamed of the face above me. Not just a stranger. Someone I had known, trusted. Someone who had killed me. As I got older, the dreams became clearer. The details sharpened. I saw flashes of another life, an old fishing cabin, a rusted truck, the feel of dirt roads under my bare feet. The lake had a name, Hollow Bend. I knew this because I had lived there before, and I had died there, drowned, murdered, by someone I had called a friend. At 18, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. Needed to know if Hollow Bend was real or just a cruel trick of my mind. So I did what any sane person wouldn't. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove halfway across the country to find it. It took me 3 days. 3 days of second guessing. 3 days of telling myself I was crazy. But when I pulled up to that lake, saw the familiar tree line, the same rocky shore from my dreams, I knew. I had been here before. The cabin was still there, rotting and abandoned. The dock was half submerged, the wood splintering with time. But the water was exactly the same. And I wasn't alone. A man stood at the edge of the dock, fishing pole in hand. Older now, gray at the temples, but I knew him instantly. The same sharp jaw, the same cold eyes, the same man who had held me under the water all those years ago. He turned, and for one horrible second our eyes met. Something flickered across his face. Recognition? Fear? Or worse, satisfaction. I don't know how long we stared at each other. I don't remember getting back in my car. All I know is I drove away as fast as I could, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. But as I reached the highway, one thought kept circling in my mind. He recognized me too, and he wasn't surprised to see me alive. But the story doesn't end there. That night, in a cheap motel miles away from Hollow Bend, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that cold, knowing smirk. I had spent years fearing water, fearing the truth. Now I knew why, and yet I couldn't let it go. I needed to know who I had been, why he had done it. I spent the next week in town, pretending I was just passing through. But I was hunting, searching, asking careful questions at diners and bait shops. And the more I learned, the more it felt like something was stalking me in return. I found old records, a missing person case, a boy in his 20s who had disappeared from town decades ago. Everyone assumed he had drowned, but there had been rumors, whispers of a fight, of debts unpaid, of betrayal. I found an old photograph, and there I was, or rather, the man I had been before, standing next to the very man who had killed me. And then I heard the knock on my motel door. Slow, deliberate. I didn't answer, didn't even breathe. But I knew who it was. I had been asking too many questions, stirring up something that should have stayed buried. The knocking stopped. Footsteps faded away. But when I checked the door the next morning, I found wet footprints leading back to my room. Like someone had walked straight out of the lake. I left town that day. Left Hollow Bend behind. But I know this isn't over. Because sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see something just behind me. A ripple. A reflection that doesn't quite match. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the water calling me back. I never believed in the supernatural. Growing up in the Scottish Highlands, I was taught to rely on logic and reason. But that was before I started having dreams that felt more like memories. It began innocently enough. I, James McLeod, a 30-year-old farmer, had always been content with my life. Married to Fiona, we lived on a modest farm passed down through generations. Our days were filled with tending to the land and animals, and our nights with simple pleasures. Then the dreams started. At first, they were fleeting. A flash of mud-caked boots, the distant sound of artillery, the acrid smell of gunpowder. But soon, they became vivid. I could feel the cold steel of a rifle in my hands, hear the cries of comrades, and see the face of a man named Edward Thompson. I knew his name, his rank, his fate. Yet I had never met him. Confused and disturbed, I began to investigate. The village library, a small stone building, became my refuge. There, I discovered that Edward Thompson was a soldier from our village who had died in 1917 during World War I. He was 30 years old, the same age I was. The more I delved into Edward's life, the stronger the connection became. I learned about his fiancée, Margaret, and their plans to marry upon his return. I visited his grave, a simple stone marker in the village cemetery, and felt an overwhelming sense of loss. One evening, as I sat by the fire, Fiona noticed my distant gaze. "James," she said softly, "you've been different lately. Is something troubling you?" I hesitated, then shared my dreams and discoveries. Fiona listened intently, her face pale. "James," she whispered, "I have something to tell you. Before we met, I was engaged to a man named Edward Thompson. He was my first love, but he died before we could marry. The room seemed to close in around me. Fiona bore an uncanny resemblance to Margaret, Edward's fiancée. Our farm was the very place where Edward had planned to meet Margaret before he was killed. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I was living the life Edward had lost. The dreams, the memories, the connection, it all made sense now. I was his reincarnation, living out the life he never had. As I stood by the window, looking out over the land, I felt a profound sense of peace. Edward's story had become mine, and in some way he had returned to the life he had once dreamed of. I was never a prodigy. Anna Miller, a 25-year-old aspiring pianist, I was content playing in small venues, my fingers dancing over the keys, lost in the music. But then the flashes began. It started with a melody, a haunting tune that seemed to come from nowhere. I couldn't place it, yet it felt familiar. Then came the dreams. I saw myself in a grand palace, surrounded by opulence, composing music. I knew the name Ludwig van Beethoven and recognized compositions I had never learned. Perplexed, I sought out Dr. Klaus Weber, a renowned music historian. Through hypnosis, I regressed to the 18th century and vividly relived moments from Beethoven's life, including composing the Ninth Symphony. The emotions were overwhelming, the passion, the struggle, the genius. But the revelations didn't stop there. I learned that Beethoven had a secret lover, a woman believed to have died young. This woman was my great-great-grandmother, who had faked her death to escape a scandal. The discovery was staggering. I was not only Beethoven's reincarnation, but also his descendant, intertwining my past and present in a profound and unsettling way. As I sat at the piano, playing the familiar melody, I realized that the music was not just a composition, it was a legacy, a connection across time. I was living the life of a man whose genius had transcended centuries, and in that moment, I understood the true power of music. I was 6 when I first said the name. I don't remember saying it, but my mom does. I was playing with my toys when I suddenly said, "I used to be Thomas Yates." My mom didn't know a Thomas Yates. Nobody in my family did. But I said it like it was a fact, and when she asked who Thomas Yates was, I told her, a man who lived in 1952 and died in a cornfield. I was a kid. Nobody took it seriously. But as I got older, things got weird. I started drawing places I'd never seen, describing people who didn't exist. I could tell you what it felt like to die, lungs filling with something thick, sticky, unable to breathe. Then when I was 16, I found him. Thomas Yates. Murdered in a small town 1,000 miles away from where I lived. The details? Exactly how I described. And then I did something stupid. I went there. The town was small, barely on the map. When I arrived, I felt a pull. I knew the streets. I walked directly to an old diner and sat in the third booth on the left, just like I remembered. An old man stared at me and whispered, "You look just like him." That's when I realized someone else remembered Thomas Yates too, and they weren't happy he was back. There's a stretch of road near my house that I never take. I don't know why. I just can't. Every time I drive past it, my chest tightens, my palms sweat, and I feel like I'm about to be sick. For years, I ignored it, chalked it up to anxiety, to overthinking. But last year, I finally broke. I took the road. It was the worst mistake of my life. I knew every curve, every crack in the pavement. My hands gripped the wheel like I was bracing for impact. And then, halfway down, I saw it. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a spot on the road. A patch of faded asphalt that sent a jolt of terror through me, so strong I had to pull over before I threw up. Because I knew, without a doubt, that I had died there before. and I wasn't alone. I stepped out of the car, drawn to the spot. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. As I knelt, I saw it, a rusted piece of metal buried in the dirt. A belt buckle, old, covered in dried blood. Then I heard the sound of tires screeching, an engine roaring. I turned, and headlights bore down on me, exactly where I had stood before. I barely jumped away in time. The car disappeared into the night, but I knew what had just happened. Someone wanted me to remember how I died. I never used to be afraid of fire. Not until I started waking up gasping for air, the smell of smoke burning my nostrils, my body drenched in sweat. It started when I moved into a new apartment. Every night, the same dream, flames surrounding me, licking at my skin, a searing pain in my lungs, and always the sound of a woman's voice screaming my name. The strangest part, I don't remember ever hearing that voice before, but I knew deep down I had loved her. At first, I wrote it off as stress. Moving was a big deal, and I had been overwhelmed with work. But then, little things started happening. One night, I woke up and smelled smoke. My heart pounded as I checked the kitchen, the outlets, the heater, nothing. Yet the scent was thick in the air, choking me. The dreams intensified. I would wake up coughing, my throat raw like I'd inhaled smoke. Then one day I found an old newspaper article tucked into a library book, 1927. A theater fire, dozens dead, and one name among them that made my blood run cold, mine. The article mentioned a man named Charles Whitaker, a stagehand at the Grand Marlowe Theater, who had perished in the fire trying to save his fiancée. Her name was Eleanor Gray. That night, I dreamt of her again. But this time, I wasn't just watching. I was there. I felt the heat of the fire, the panic in my chest as I ran down the burning corridors, calling her name. The ceiling collapsed, and everything went black. When I woke up, my hands were covered in smoke. From there, everything spiraled. I started researching the fire obsessively. I visited the ruins of the old theater, now a historical landmark. Standing there, I felt a pull so strong I nearly collapsed. Then I heard a voice, soft, pleading. "Charlie, please." I turned, but no one was there. The deeper I dug, the more I remembered. The fire had been no accident. Someone had set it deliberately, and the man who had done it was still alive. I found an old photograph of the theater staff. One man stood out, sharp features, a piercing gaze. My hands trembled as I compared his face to an image in an article I had pulled up about local history. It was a perfect match to an elderly man who still lived in the city. I had to see him. When I finally tracked him down, he was in a nursing home, frail but alert. I sat across from him, my heart racing. "You were there," I said. His eyes widened, his breath hitched. "You should be dead," he whispered. We were clearing out my grandmother's house after she passed when I found the photograph. Black and white, faded, a group of people standing outside an old factory. Something about it caught my eye. Then I saw him, a man in the back, staring directly at the camera. His face was sharp, familiar, too familiar. I felt a jolt of cold recognition run down my spine, because he looked exactly like me. I showed my mom, expecting her to laugh it off, but instead, she went pale. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That photo was taken in 1896. I laughed it off, but unease settled in my stomach. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop staring at the photo. The more I looked, the more I felt connected, as if I knew that place, knew those people. Then I found the journal. It was tucked away in an old chest in my grandmother's attic. Leather-bound, brittle pages, written in a tight, slanted script. The name inside? Samuel Everett. The first few entries were normal. Factory work, daily struggles. But then a chilling passage stopped me cold. "I have seen my own death. Samuel went on to describe a vision, being followed, feeling hunted. A deep paranoia seeped into his words. And then, the final entry. They will come for me tonight. The date was 2 days after the photograph had been taken. I started searching historical records, determined to prove it was all a coincidence. But the deeper I went, the more it unraveled me. Samuel Everett had vanished without a trace. No body, no explanation, just gone. And then the nightmares started. I dreamt of running. Dark streets, heavy footsteps behind me, a sharp pain in my side, warm blood pooling under my fingers. One night, I woke up with a bruise on my ribs, exactly where I had been stabbed in the dream. And then, one evening, as I stared at the photo yet again, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the reflection of a window behind the group, barely visible, was the silhouette of a man, watching Samuel, watching me. I found an old address in the journal, Samuel's last known residence. Against my better judgment, I went. The building had long been abandoned, but as I stood in the doorway, the overwhelming sense of déjà vu hit me like a brick. I stepped inside, and suddenly I could remember everything. The betrayal, the chase, the knife. And then I heard a voice, whispering from the dark. "You came back." I never believed in past lives, reincarnation, déjà vu, all that stuff. It always seemed like wishful thinking, something people clung to for comfort. But if you're listening to this, just hear me out. What happened to me wasn't just some eerie coincidence. It was something I wish I could forget. It started when I was 34. I was a corporate lawyer living in Chicago, engaged and working my ass off for a promotion. My fiancée, Rachel, was a journalist. Life was normal. Until one night, I had a dream so vivid, I woke up sweating. In it, I was standing on a dirt road, in the middle of nowhere, under a yellowed sky. A woman was screaming. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, was choking her. I could smell the dust, the metallic tang of blood. The man turned to me, and for some reason, I knew his name. Daniel Whitmore. I had no idea where the name came from. It was like I had pulled it from thin air. But when I woke up, it was still there, sitting in my head like an unwanted guest. And the feeling, God, the feeling. I knew I had been there before. I knew it wasn't just a dream. I brushed it off. Stress, maybe. Too much work. But the dreams kept coming. Every night, more details. I was standing closer. I could see the woman's face, blonde, young, early 20s. She fought hard, but the man was stronger. And then the worst part, I realized I wasn't just watching. I was in his body. I was Daniel Whitmore. I started digging. Whitmore wasn't a name I recognized, but something about it felt old, like it belonged to a different era. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. So one night, after another dream where I felt the woman's last breath against my skin, I got up, sat at my laptop, and typed the name into Google. Daniel Whitmore. 1954. Arkansas. And there it was, a newspaper article, yellowed and scanned into some archive, about a man arrested for the murder of a woman named Mary Cartwright. He had strangled her in the woods outside Little Rock. The article had a grainy black and white picture. The man in the photo was the one from my dreams. But that's not what made my blood run cold. It was the next article. The follow-up. Whitmore was never convicted. The evidence was circumstantial. He walked free. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. This was real. And I knew things no one else did. The exact way she fought. The way he had laughed when she clawed at his face. The dreams, the memories, they weren't just dreams. They were his memories, or rather mine. I had been Daniel Whitmore in another life. And that meant I had gotten away with murder. There are things worse than death. I know because I lived them. Twice. I was 23 when I first saw it. The tunnel. The the gray stone walls, the damp air that smelled like rust and rot. My friends and I had been exploring an abandoned prison upstate, the kind of place urban explorers flock to. It was supposed to be fun, but when I turned the corner and saw the tunnel stretching out before me, something in my gut told me to turn back. I didn't listen. I stepped inside. The light from my flashlight bounced off the curved walls, revealing graffiti from past explorers. But then, just for a second, the writing changed. It wasn't spray paint anymore. It was carved into the stone. Letters deep and jagged, like someone had scratched them with bleeding fingers. Help me. The air turned thick. My lungs felt heavy. And suddenly, I wasn't in the tunnel anymore. I was locked in a cell, naked, starving. My wrists were raw from shackles. I could hear the slow drip of water, the scratch of rats against stone. I knew where I was, and I knew I had been there before. In that moment, memories flooded back, memories of another life. A prisoner, falsely accused, left to die in a forgotten wing of this very prison. I remembered screaming until my throat was raw. I remembered clawing at the door, and I remembered the moment I gave up. When I snapped back to reality, my friends were shaking me. I had collapsed. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the tunnel, because I knew beyond any doubt that my bones were still in there, and no one had ever found them. And deep down, I knew she was right. Growing up, my mother always had this weird sadness in her eyes when she looked at me. She loved me, but there was something else, something almost haunted. I didn't understand it until I turned 10, and the memories started coming back. They weren't dreams, not exactly. They were more like flashes, quick, overwhelming glimpses of another life. I remembered a different mother, a different house, a different name, and worst of all, I remembered dying. A fever. A young boy gasping for breath in a small bedroom. My mother's screams. One night I woke up sobbing and my mom rushed in. Between breaths, I whispered a name I didn't understand. Charlie? She turned white as a sheet. My parents never talked about him, but I learned the truth that night. My mother had lost her first son, Charlie, before I was born. The doctors had told her she'd never conceive again, and yet 2 years later, she had me. She clutched me, sobbing, saying over and over, "You came back to me." I've always been terrified of small spaces. My family used to joke that I must have been buried alive in a past life. I laughed along, but deep down, the idea sat like a stone in my chest. When I was a kid, I had violent nightmares of being crushed by rock, suffocating in pitch blackness while my screams went unheard. Then, years later, I visited an old mining town with some friends. They thought it'd be fun to tour an abandoned iron mine. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach turned. My lungs felt too small. The deeper we went, the more familiar everything felt. The smell of wet stone, the wooden beams overhead. I knew what was around each corner before the guide even spoke. Then I saw it, a rusted, half-buried nameplate. The name on it sent ice through my veins. It was mine, or at least it had been. John Malley, a miner who had been trapped in a collapse in 1892, his body never recovered. My friends thought I was messing with them when I nearly collapsed. I didn't go any further into that mine, but in my gut, I knew I had already been there before, and I had died there alone in the dark. I never wanted to be a doctor. I hated hospitals, the smell of antiseptic, the way people looked at you with desperation or dread. But ever since I was a kid, I knew things about the human body that no 6-year-old should. I could name bones, arteries, and organs without ever being taught. My parents thought I was just bright. I thought I was just weird. It wasn't until my 20s that the dreams started. I wasn't myself in them. I was a man in a white coat, performing surgeries with meticulous precision. My hands moved with practiced ease, and I knew, instinctively, what to do. I would wake up sweating, my fingers aching as if I'd really been holding a scalpel all night. Then I saw him. One day, scrolling through an old medical archive online, I found a black and white photo of a man who looked exactly like the person in my dreams, Dr. William Hargrave, a celebrated surgeon in the early 1900s. As I read about him, a cold dread settled in my gut. He had been accused of something horrifying, performing operations on patients who hadn't consented, all in the name of medical advancement. Some had survived, mutilated and furious, but many had died. The strangest part, he vanished before he could face justice. I told myself it was a coincidence. One night, in another dream, I saw the hands I was using, the surgeon's hands, covered in blood. And when I looked in the mirror, it wasn't my face staring back. It was his. We'd love to hear your own creepy past life memories. Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other spine-chilling videos.